our identity is a child of God. That is our true identity. But we may be a person who struggles with depression or a person who struggles with anxiety, but that doesn't necessarily define us.
So we covered some of the misconceptions. We covered some of the stigma that may prevent us from learning more about mental health or discovering, our own mental illness. Like, what does that mean? Do I have a mental illness? Or I think the next question is, how do we recognize that? Like, if we start feeling sad, or we start feeling like a little nervous, is that the same as being depressed or anxious? Like, how do we start to recognize, I might need to ask for help. I might need to go see somebody.
That's a good question for a lot of reasons. So I think, first of all, God created us with emotions, right? So he had emotions. We have emotions. And I think that when we feel them and they're appropriate for the situation, I think all is good, right? There are sad things that happen, and we will cry and we'll be upset. People make us angry and we'll get mad. Before we go and do something that's new or whatever, we might feel nervous about it. Like, I think all of that is normal. When it needs to be addressed, it's when the reactions and the emotions that are associated don't match, right? So if your dog dies, that's sad, right? And he could be your best friend and all of that, and that could be very impactful on you, and you will experience the grief of it and all of that. That's normal, right? But I think then there are the situations where that sadness, then it just grows and grows and grows and grows, and all of a sudden 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, you still can't get out of bed. You still can't function. You still can't do your job. You decided, okay, I can't even shower anymore because I'm so depressed. I think that's when it's like, okay, this is not in proportion to the event that happened.
Yeah.
And I'm not minimizing the death of a pet, but I'm just saying, like, literally, if several months down the road, like, you still can't function, like, that's like a big difference, right? And so I know, like, criteria that we look for, like when we're diagnosing, are these emotions and the effects of those emotions impacting your ability to function in life, really? And if they are, then that's when you know that there's really a problem that you need to address.
Yeah. For me, it was always like, if I'm asking the question, do I need to see somebody? The answer is probably always yes.
Yes. That's a good way to look at it.
If I have that question in my mind, because I don't lose anything by going to visit somebody. Like, if I walked into your office and said, hey, can we do a session? And we did a session, and you said, hey, yeah, you're just going through a normal emotion. Like, at least I would know.
Exactly. And I think too, the reality is we all could benefit from therapy. Let's be real. We live in a broken world. Stuff is happening all around us. Life is hard. I hate to say all people should go to therapy, but kind of,
Yeah. 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 It's like the spiritual discipline for our age, like, they just didn't have that language, when the church first started. But for me, it's become like a spiritual discipline of like, okay, like, I go to therapy, I pray, I read my Bible, I sit in silence and I meditate and confess my sins, and I go to therapy.
And I'm a therapist, and I go to therapy.
Yeah.
I could sit in the mirror and have a conversation with myself, but that's not gonna do it. Like, I need a safe person to whom I can dump everything on, And going back to your question too about, like, what's just normal emotion and what's not. So the second part of my answer, I think, for that is also, growing up, we didn't have the language or the labels to describe anxiety, depression, bipolar, like any of that. Now we have the language. There is an emphasis on it. And now a lot of times when people are sad, I'm depressed.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes those labels are being slapped on stuff, I think, a little too fast.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, so not only like culturally speaking, when we use that language with one another, do we dilute that, but even from a therapeutic standpoint, like I know for me personally, like bipolar can become a catch-all.
Yeah.
You know, we don't really know, and so it kind of muddies the water. So like you would say, hey, like let's be more careful with the words that we're using to describe our feelings.
Exactly. Because I think, it's like the pendulum is flipped, and it's like, okay, everything right now is not anxiety. Everything right now is not depression. So if anxiety and depression are up here, sadness and fear are kind of here. Everything's not a 10.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so that's where we also have to be careful because, a lot with the students that I work with in my practice, it's like, I'm so depressed. And it's like, okay, are you, or are you just sad about something? And they might be, and we work it out. But I think they're very quick to use the language.
Yeah.
Which is good and bad,
Yeah. Yeah, well, because like the word means something. It means something, and it means something serious. So like we want to have the same, definition, for what those things are.
Exactly. And same too with even just language like, oh, I'd rather die, or oh, I wish I was dead, or oh, I'm gonna just kill myself over that. Like making those comments very flippantly. It's like you were saying, like the words have meaning, and so. I don't know. You just have to be really careful.
Yeah. I think that our tendency also, at least me growing up, is to identify with the emotion, to say, I am,
Yes.
right? Like I am depressed and I am anxious, like that. I am an anxious person. But that's hard because it's not really our identity. So like what's the difference between acknowledging and identifying with an emotion?
Right, exactly. And I think there's a big difference because I think that our identity is a child of God. That is our true identity. But we may be a person who struggles with depression or a person who struggles with anxiety, but that doesn't necessarily define us.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of another like thought trap too, where it's like, I have anxiety, I am anxiety, I'm always worried, like, and putting all those labels on yourself. And in the process, you're creating all these neural pathways in your brain that are just ingraining that identity over and over, and that's really not it, right?
Yeah.
It's reframing it, and it's, no, I'm a human, and I'm struggling with anxiety right now.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's. I know for me that was a big aha moment in my life. Is that like I am not this thing. I'm much more than this thing. How do you get people to see you're so much more than this?
A lot of times I use a lot of analogies, right? So if you have a heart condition, right, or high blood pressure, let's say, you don't walk, like that's not your identity.
You are not high blood pressure.
Yeah, you are not high blood pressure, right? You are not anxiety. You are not depression. You are not high blood pressure. You struggle with high blood pressure and you're doing things in your life to combat that. Just like I might be struggling with anxiety, but I'm doing things in my life to kind of combat that too.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah.
That's really good. As, people are navigating this in our lives and around us, if we have a family member or a friend, a lot of the questions I get from people is, how do I help? Like if people know my story, they ask me, hey, I have a child or I have a friend or a family member. How do I help? So what are helpful ways, or what are ways that people can help? Because I know sometimes what seems helpful can hurt.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah, and going back to Brené Brown, she does a whole lot with like empathy versus sympathy, right? And so a lot of times, people who want to help us have never really walked in our shoes. They may have experienced something similar, but it's still not the exact same thing with us. And sometimes like the best thing that people can do to help is to actually just say, I don't know how to fix this for you. I wish I could, but can I just sit here with you? I'm here to listen, not here to necessarily fix the problem or solve the problem, or, let me just climb down kind of in this space with you. And if you need this time, I'll just sit here. We can sit. I'll sit and watch a movie with you, We can sit, we don't even have to speak, but just my presence kind of side by side, just kind of sharing that space is sometimes like the best help you can get.
Are there questions that are helpful? Like, would you prefer me to be distant? Like, are there questions that you could think of that might come up where, like, my initial reaction is to hug somebody, but maybe they don't want to be touched.
Exactly. Yeah, because the touch could be very triggering to them because of a trauma that you weren't even aware.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that it's fair. I think that it's actually really great to be like, I would love to give you a hug if you're comfortable with that, or is there something that I can do? Because sometimes that's what they need, right? I have some clients I'm working with who have kind of repeated panic attacks, and sometimes they need their significant other to kind of step in. Sometimes they need the space. And so when they're in a good state, we talk about like, okay, well, can you communicate to him or can you communicate to her right now when you're grounded and centered and you're feeling really well? What do you need when you're experiencing that? And then they have those conversations so that when the rough times come, they kind of know what to do. And so then they don't feel as helpless either, you know?
Yeah, for sure. What boundaries do you have to keep in place as that friend or family member? Because I can imagine, I know from my own experience that I probably asked too much of people, or that there were just lines that like people, couldn't go there. I lost a lot of friendships, and at first I was angry about that. And then I just came to realize like I was really sick. And there are some people who like, in order to stay healthy, they needed to set boundaries in their life, even though it may not have felt the greatest.
Yeah. Boundaries are hard. And I think that as a caretaker, I think viewing boundaries though, not as a punishment to the person, but instead sometimes like knowing kind of like what the boundaries, where the lines are, is actually really helpful for both parties, right? So you're not doing it to them as a punishment. You're showing them where their kind of freedom is, or how far you're willing to go to help them.
Yeah.
Which is actually kind of empowering for them in a way, because then they know kind of where the line is. I think the biggest boundary I think that a caretaker needs to put up is their own self-care. Because I think it's really, really easy to get so caught up in the person who's struggling, and all of their stuff then becomes your stuff. And then all of a sudden you're way down, and then you become almost useless to them because you're so depleted of everything. Your bucket is empty. You have nothing left to give them. And now you have two people who are struggling instead of one. So it's really important that you kind of have those boundaries for your own self-care. And there are things in place. There's, hotlines, if you wake up in the night and you're struggling and it's not like life or death emergency, you can call this support line and they can help you or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
there are other resources.
Exactly.
I think as the caretaker, maybe sometimes it feels like I'm the only one. Especially if that person sees you as the only one, then it feels like it's harder to see the resources that are around you. You talked about setting boundaries not as kind of an ultimatum, right? Like you're not using this as well, if you do this, then I'm out.
Right.
It's really about self-care. Maybe there's encouragement for people who just feel like I can't set boundaries because it's too harsh, and I need to be there for this person. What kind of encouragement would you give them for setting those boundaries?
I think first of all, speaking to the person you're helping in love, that communicating like, this is not a punishment to you. I'm not trying to hurt you. I want to be available to help you. But in order to do so, I need to step back here so that I can fill myself back up.
Yeah.
Because you can't pour out of an empty cup.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah, and for those, wrestling, suffering with a mental illness, like they may not understand.
Right.
That it doesn't change the fact that you need the boundaries, but you may communicate them as clearly as humanly possible. But because there is a disconnect between, what's real and what, like what's happening emotionally, Like I know for me, my family put really healthy boundaries in place, but they felt oppressive.
Exactly. And at that point, when you're struggling so much, the lens through which you filter everything is clouded.
Yeah.
And so it's not clear. You don't have the clarity that you need to be able to see necessarily what they're doing to help you.
Yeah.
A caregiver in that situation should probably seek some kind of support for themselves as well.
Yeah.
Whether
Oh,
it's
that's good.
therapy or even a support group for people who are caring for people with a certain condition or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's really important
Yeah.
because they're going to burn out.
Yeah, for sure. We talked about the stigma and misconceptions, that may keep somebody from looking for help. We also talked about, if you're in that zone of like, should I see somebody, or not? If you're asking that question, maybe that's a good zone for you to be in. But how would you suggest somebody start that process? Like, it's a super scary thing, like to go out and, you can search for, or you call your insurance company and say, okay, I'm looking for a therapist or whatever. But you get a list of names.
Exactly.
How do you know where to even start? If you're at that point where I need help, where do you even start?
Like you said, I mean, a lot of people start with their insurance companies because the finances are a thing. I mean, if you can pay a $10 copay to see a therapist versus $130 out of pocket,
Right.
Hi, that's a lot. I mean, that's a huge difference. So starting with the insurance company is always a good place to start because then you do at least have a list of names. I think also finding people that you know who might be seeing a therapist. Hey, I'm looking for a therapist. I've heard you mention before that you really like yours. Could I get the name?
Yeah.
And then I know a lot of times I'll get calls or emails and I might not be accepting new clients at the time, but I can say, but here are a few that I would recommend. So then word of mouth, I think, is definitely, one of your best bets. Psychology Today, if you go on Psychology Today on the internet and you type in your zip code, a slew of therapists will pop up. There's usually a photo and then a bio. So you can at least get more than just your insurance company list.
Yeah.
And on Psychology Today, it'll say, what insurance companies the therapist may take.
Okay.
A lot of therapists, though, are self-pay.
Yeah.
Which if your insurance is such that you can get reimbursed, that's great.
Yeah.
But a lot aren't.
Yeah.
So.
If no one has been through that experience before of going to a therapist for the first time, what's something that they can expect? Like, what does the process look like? Because that's part of the fear.
Oh, yeah.
For me too, is like, okay, now I've contacted this person. I don't know what I'm getting myself into. What does that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, that first day is terrible. I mean, I can remember the very first therapy session I ever had. As the client, I was so scared. And this is before I, started working in the field. But you kind of walk in like a deer in headlights. Like, you walk in the room, there's typically a couch and maybe a chair or two. Do you sit on the couch? Do you sit in the chairs? Like, I don't know. A therapist will say, a good therapist might say, you can sit anywhere you'd like. Or they can say you can have a seat on the couch. They might be specific, which is helpful because then you're like, okay, at least I know I got the seat down.
Yeah. Got the seat down.
Got the seat down. In the first session, typically the first session of therapy is not really therapy per se. It's usually an intake appointment. So in that appointment, the therapist will typically kind of share with you who they are, kind of what their areas of expertise, interests are. Maybe, you can ask them where they went to school. You can ask, them all the questions. They typically will explain how therapy works. In a session, I think insurance says that an hour session is about 53 minutes. Some therapists take it all the way to the hour. Some people cut it off at 53, whatever. They're usually very specific about the time. In an intake, they'll go over kind of like your whole history. They'll ask you questions that sometimes seem like they're completely insignificant, like, why do you need to know this? But trust me, it all kind of paints the picture of the client that you're working with. They're going to ask a lot of questions about eating, sleeping, exercise, so that way they can assess kind of how you're doing in general. They also want to know about like your family support system, like who are your friends, who is your family, who do you live with? And that's really important for us to know so that if you leave and it's been a difficult session, we know that you're going home to someone and you're in a safe space. We definitely want to know history of, any kind of psychiatric history, any hospitalizations, then also any like significant medical things, because a lot of time there's medical trauma as well as different body functions can impact your mental health. So if you have a problem with your thyroid, sometimes the symptoms that you feel with like an overactive thyroid can feel like anxiety symptoms. Your heart races, you feel jittery, like that can all be that. So kind of having that complete picture is really, really helpful. And then you'll also sign and be told about an informed consent where it goes over confidentiality. And that's the other thing about therapy too, I guess we haven't really addressed. It is 100% confidential. So if you're my client, I cannot tell another soul that you're my client. Like it is strictly confidential. If I see you in Target, I can't be like, hey, Brad, and point you out when I'm shopping with my family. And then my family are like, who is that? And you talk about that all ahead of time so that there aren't any real awkward moments. Brad, if I see you in Target and I'm with my family, would you be more comfortable if I just kind of like ignored you? Would it be more comfortable to you if I just said hi, smiled? What is best for you? Some people are like, I don't care. I'd want you to come up and talk to me. Some people are like, yeah, no, please don't. Like, don't even pretend like I'm just a stranger in the store. So you kind of go over all of that so you know kind of like what to expect.
Yeah.
It's very, very crystal clear. And then I'll give time for questions. Like, do you have any questions for me? And then one thing I try to make sure I do is just assure the person that, okay, there are a million therapists out there. My goal for you is to feel better. If I'm not the therapist for you, I am fine with that. You don't have to be afraid to come and tell me after 3 or 4 sessions, Suzie, I really like you. You're a nice person, but I don't think you're the one that's going to be able to help me.
Yeah.
And I'm not offended by it. I want to help you get help. So I'm going to work with you and we're going to find somebody to help you.
Yeah.
And a good therapist should not be offended by that at all. Then you'll also kind of go over like scheduling. Like, is this something that you would like to come in weekly for? Every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever. I like to say that as we're kind of getting started, I like to see people every week just to kind of build that relationship. And that's the other thing. Your relationship with your therapist is unlike any other relationship that you have. You, as the client, are sharing all of this intimate, deep stuff. So you feel like you two have become like besties, right? Because you've now shared with them all the things.
Right.
They're not really sharing back all their things. So it's a different kind of relationship. I like to say it's a sacred space. That room is your space, your time, your hour to kind of be who you need to be and share what you need to share. And I feel like it's kind of sacred.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would say to somebody like, I've got to have a Christian counselor and that's it? Is there any chance that any other therapist might not consider their faith as a part of a treatment plan?
Well, it's interesting. When I first started therapy as a client, I remember someone said to me, you better make sure they're a Christian because they're getting inside your head. Okay, yes. And no. Like, as counselors in graduate school, we take diversity classes. So we have to be able to support anyone where they are, right? It is not my job to convert you. I may ask you questions like, if you're coming to me for grief, well, what do you think happens to someone when they die? Like I can ask you those questions. I can show you unconditional love like Jesus. I can do all those things, but I can't start throwing scripture at you and saying, oh, you're not saved? Oh, Like that's not my job. That's not my role. But I can show you that with my life.
Yeah. And so maybe like, if that fear is, well, they're not going to take my faith seriously, on the flip end of what you're talking about, like you're not going to convert anybody, but they're also not going to try to dissuade you from your faith.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. And as a therapist, like my goal is to supply you with as many coping skills, resources, supports I can possibly give you So if for you it's a Buddhist faith, I'm going to have you tap into that because that's going to be your source of strength, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess it's really a personal choice. Some of my clients are very like, can you pray with me at the end of a session? The Christian clients, and sure I will. I mean, some of them are like, can you help me find a scripture for that? Like, I absolutely will. I pray for my clients in between sessions, whether they're believers or not believers. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how important that is. I mean, it's literally an individual choice.
Yeah. But where you would say, like, listen, if you want a Christian counselor, totally understand that. Let's make sure that they have the credentials behind them, because you wouldn't go to like a mechanic just because he's a Christian and you're like, oh, it doesn't matter that you don't know how to put cars back together.
Exactly.
You're a Christian, so it'll all work out.
Exactly. Yeah. Be in the center of God's will for that.
Right. Yeah.
No, but seriously, you're exactly right. I mean, you go to, a doctor, like your general doctor. I don't think, the general doctor I see is a believer, but I know if I'm sick, she'll take care of me. Yeah,
that's a good point. Like if I went to the hospital, I'd say, give me your finest Christian surgeon. It's like, no, just give me your finest surgeon.
Exactly.
Like,
I want your top surgeon.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah. But again, for some people, that's really, really, really important.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. And I wouldn't want, anybody watching, like there's no minimizing that at all. Mm-hmm. It's just understanding that, just because they say, hey, I'm a faith-based counselor, it's really more important to see first, like, do they have the credentials behind them? Mm-hmm. Again, it's super important to make sure that you're finding people who are trained to help you.
Exactly. And most therapists go into therapy because they love people and they empathize. They have like a huge gift for empathy. And so whatever you believe, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to lock eyes with you, and I'm going to hold that safe space for you where you can be who you need to be and say what you need to say. And I'm going to care about you no matter what.
Yeah.
And I only want the best for you. It's that do no harm. So I'm not going to say or do anything intentionally that's going to, veer you off your path of healing. So
yeah. How do you know that you found the right therapist?
That's
How do you know that you found the right professional to help you?
I think you just know. Like, that sounds kind of freaky, but I think if you feel like you're in a space where you can be the most authentic you and feel like you're not being judged and you're not being condemned and you don't feel like you have to hold back, then I think you're in the right space. I think you're with the right person. And I mean, there are people that you aren't going to connect with, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
But I think just innately you're going to know, you're going to feel safe, you're going to feel comfortable, you're going to feel heard. One of my clients told me that they had tested out a lot of people, and one of their therapists fell asleep in the middle of one of their sessions. Probably not the therapist for you, right?
Can you imagine?
On so many levels.
Wow.
Like, that's just not right. And we're all human. I mean, there could have been a very good reason they could have taken NyQuil or something in the morning, or I don't know what. But, like, that's just...
That's not your person.
No, it's not your person.
Yeah. How do you, because for me, I can talk myself into saying, yeah, they're not really those things, because I don't really want the help. Like they're making me feel uncomfortable, not because of who they are, but because of the emotions that they're bringing up. So is there like, would you say that feeling after the first session? Would you recommend, hey, hang out for a month, or like what would be the...
I would say hang out, because like I said, the first session is very, not scripted, but it's very... it's just an intake, right? It's you're, as the therapist, you're trying to connect with your client, but you're also trying to gain as much information as possible.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, the intake is always kind of like, for me, is always like the table of contents of a book. It's like, it's not like there's nothing exciting about the table of contents, but like you need to see what's coming up, and then you get into the story. For me, it was always like, okay, I'm going to see like a month or two
Yeah.
But then there also comes a point where like, okay, you've been seeing somebody for a few years. Maybe it's time to, maybe you feel like I don't need to see them as often, or maybe I don't need to see them anymore. Is there a period where you just, that relationship isn't necessary in a season of life? Like how do it kind of like medication, maybe you wouldn't say, hey, just stop cold turkey. But what does that process look like of, hey, we've come to a good place. Do I have to bring that up as a patient?
You can bring it up as the client, and the therapist should bring it up as the therapist. Like, if you're working together that long and that hard, and you're, as the therapist, seeing growth, along the way, you're pointing that out to the client. Hey, you just shared with me this story. You were with your mother-in-law this weekend, and look how you did all of those things that we've been talking about. Okay, and you with your boss, you had said how whatever uncomfortable he made you, and look at how you've handled that. Like, you are doing so well.
Yeah.
And they may come in, and you're noticing that in your sessions, you're celebrating more victories than you are kind of like dredging up like a lot of new things. And it's like, hey, you're doing really well. I've been seeing you every week. Do you feel comfortable? What if we space it out every 2 weeks and see? If you need me in that first week, you have my number, we'll make it work. But let's see if we can go 2 weeks. And then you might do 2 weeks for a couple of months, and you're like, all right, you are crushing it. We've been talking about all of your successes. Now let's space it out to like once a month. And then it gets to the point where it's like, I have one person I'm seeing every 3 or 4 months. It's just kind of a check-in.
Yeah.
Just so they know that they still kind of have a space on my caseload, and they just want to kind of update me on, not a lot of therapies happening in those sessions. It's more kind of like an update, but they feel comfortable and safe knowing that they have me, and it works. So yeah.
So there is a progression. There is a, hey, this may not be a forever thing, and it may just come in seasons too, right? Like you may not ever be done with therapy. You might just take some time off.
Exactly.
We talked before about the connection kind of between spiritual health and emotional health. Do you think that we put too much on pastors as far as like, hey, like because there's this connection between spiritual health and mental health, well, then you can adequately speak into that. Like, is there a zone of like, like, I guess, how would you train pastors who aren't trained, in that, where like people might feel like they need to respond in that moment because they're seen as like pastor? Like, what would you recommend they say to somebody who's asking for help that they're unprepared?
Refer help.
Refer. Yeah. Like, build relationships with
some therapists in the community or whatever, because I think that pastors are already pouring themselves out. Like, you guys work so hard. I think that, some of them have like an actual bent for therapy, and maybe they've been trained, and that's great. But if they haven't, just refer them out. Listen to the, the story of the person who's coming to you and all of that. But hey, listen, I don't know that I'm equipped to be the one to handle this for you, but hey, here are the names of 4 good therapists I know.
It's really good.
I would love for you to reach out and make contact with them. If you give me permission, I can reach out ahead of time and let them know, I'm sending you or whatever.
Yeah.
Don't bite off more than you can chew.
Yeah, that's really good. And for those of us who are, potential clients, you can't expect everything from everybody. And so there's, if you want to learn what John, verse 9 or chapter 9, verse 5 means, like, pastor's a great place. You want to learn how to pray. Pastor's a great place for that.
Yep.
But outside it, like when it comes to getting actual, like, understanding your emotions, understanding how to manage those, like.
Yep. And I think one of the greatest gifts a pastor can give his congregation is to speak from the pulpit about, share your own mental health struggles. And hey, I'm a pastor and I see a therapist. Like, that is huge.
Yeah.
Because it gives permission to the congregation, like, wait a minute, if anybody has like a direct line to God, they should, like, that's kind of the congregation's mentality. Like, they want to emulate, I think, what the pastor does. So if the pastor can be that real and say, I came to the point in my life, this crossroads, and I didn't know what to do, and I sought help from mental health help. It's huge.
Yeah. You had sent me some resources when we were talking. If would those books be okay to put in like the description?
Sure.
So if you're watching on YouTube, we'll put them in the description.
Sure.
And at least it's a good start to start figuring out how to have those conversations and where to start.
Yeah, you just have to be careful. And any book that says 3 easy steps, no, we're gonna just pass over that. Click on a different Amazon page because nothing is easy. And I think that goes back to kind of everything we talked about. So in the therapy journey, it is not easy. Like, it is hard. You are going to pull up things that you were hoping that you could forget. You're going to look at things that might make you realize, like, I didn't necessarily make the best choice. Or, wow, that was done to me and I never really dealt with it. So sometimes in therapy, and I'm sorry I didn't say this earlier, you might seem like you're getting worse before you're getting better, because you're bringing out a lot of stuff that you've stuffed in for a long time.
Yeah, but if you keep going at it, you'll get better.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a good therapist is going to hold that space for you. And on the first day, you're not going to vomit up every single thing that you've ever done, thought, felt, had done to you, whatever. Like, it's going to be a gradual little process. And I talk about it like it's all kind of locked in this little box, and we're taking little bits out at a time because you don't want to be overwhelmed by all of it.
Yeah. That's really great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on
This
Midweek. I'm hoping that this starts a bigger conversation within our church and churches in general. And I would love, if people are watching, I'd love for you to write any questions that you have in the comment section. Either I'll reach out to Suzie and I'll ask her, hey, like, how would you respond to this question? And I'll answer your question on our YouTube channel, or we'll just have to have you back on.
I mean, it's possible.
Anything's possible. We'll just make an appointment.
That's right. Exactly. 3 easy steps. Get me back here. No big deal.
Sounds so good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.